You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. If you've ever hung out in Oregon's Fort Stevens State Park, you've probably come face to face with the Peter Iredale shipwreck. The British vessel crashed onto the coast in 1906 and has stayed there ever since. Today, it's become quite the tourist attraction. But for all its notoriety, the Peter Iredale is just one of more than 2,000 shipwrecks that happened along a dangerous stretch of coastline in the Pacific Northwest. And with many of these wrecks came conflict. A new documentary explores how shipwrecks led to tension and sometimes violence between Indigenous communities and colonists in the Pacific Northwest. Anna King is a senior correspondent for Northwest Public Broadcasting and the director of Wrecked. First-time director of a film. Anna, congratulations and welcome back to Soundside.
Thank you so much, Libby.
So I want to set the scene a little bit. There is this phrase that comes up a lot in the documentary, and that is Graveyard of the Pacific. What is the Graveyard of the Pacific? What does that refer to?
Yeah, Libby, the Graveyard of the Pacific is an area off of Oregon, Washington, and the Vancouver Island coasts. And most of that is really dangerous, pericoloso, if you said it in Italian. But basically, it's more than 2,000 shipwrecks have happened here because of really unsafe conditions. We have the tide, the currents from the Columbia River, winds, heavy fog, massive waves, sandbars, and a rocky coast, all combining into basically a death trap for ships.
Yeah, I was fascinated to see the breakdown of the sandbars and how they come out like almost like arms from the coastline on the north and south side of the Columbia River, and then you have those middle sandbars. So a lot of perilous conditions for ships. And in many cases, these shipwrecks you show in the documentary and through your conversations, when they happened, they bred hostility between different groups in the region. So what tensions developed between Indigenous communities and colonial shipwreck survivors that you found?
Yeah, sometimes it was tension over the resources that these ships would carry. Sometimes they would be laden with goods to trade or sell, food, cloth, buttons, metal, guns. And indigenous people knew their nations were sovereign and that they could claim anything that washed up on their coasts. And that created a bit of conflicts with these settlers or colonialists that came in, and they wanted the resources that were on the land on North America. And sometimes indigenous communities actually bailed out these in trouble ships, saving people off of them. And many times the communities would even care for the shipwreck victims for months after a disaster until they could be returned to another ship or settlement.
You spoke to a lot of people for this documentary, Anna, but who are the key voices that you really leaned on in order to tell this story in Wrecked?
The two voices that really stood out to me are Cole Thrush. He's the author of the book Wrecked, which our short documentary is based on. And then also Tony Nacio Johnson, the chairman of the Chinook Indian Nation. Cole is so knowledgeable as a historian, a professor, and a scholar. His book Wrecked is just a beautiful read, Libby. And he talks about these hidden histories of the wrecks and how these stories that we tell ourselves about why we belong here as colonizers, like we died for this, it was hard to come here, and so we belong here. And then Tony Nacio Johnson is a really astute man. On his back porch, which was painted red and looked over Willapa Bay, he taught me about how their canoe paddles are shaped with two points at the end. And so that's so they can push off the shore with rocks and mud better and use their boats better. And he also talked about how many current towns and cities that we know, Astoria, Ilwaco, Long Beach, that many of these towns are built up around ancient village sites that had been there for centuries.
I really appreciated the way Tony explained the local communities, the Indigenous communities' perspective on these shipwrecks. Like when things would wash up on the shore, it's like, well, clearly, according to our custom, and practice, this is our resource. And so, yes, we would help the survivors. And then, sometimes there would be these clashes because obviously the companies that sent these ships, they are, looking for profit, and the local communities who are saying, wait a second, this is our stuff. It's in our land. We're part of this. Tony's, really kind of thread the needle there on explaining the perspective of the local Chinook and Indigenous tribes. And there's so much that you explore here in Wrecked. Anna, was there anything that changed your perspectives on shipwrecks?
Sometimes I feel like shipwrecks are just like this bygone era or something long ago. People with old-timey clothes or pirate movies and the wooden ship decks that are being swabbed with a mop. But when I was down there, I realized that even with all of our technology and all of our advancements, the power of our Pacific Ocean is still formidable. It takes a lot not to crash near the mouth of the Columbia River. And as we've seen, Nike shoes, rubber ducks, oil spills, we've seen some recent accidents on the Northwest coast and up in Alaska, and it could still happen at any time, Libby.
You highlight in Wrecked that these shipwrecks weren't just causing, localized tension between the people who would wash up, the colonial folks who would wash up, and then the indigenous people. There are also examples of how the shipwreck would lead to physical violence against indigenous communities. So, like, an outside force coming in to cause violence. So, tell me about the William and Anne wreck.
This is really thanks to Cole Thrush's research and those before him that documented these cases. But yes, in the case of the William and Anne in 1829, the ship went down on the Clatsop Spit, and all the men likely drowned in that incident. And Cole Thrush writes that in his book Wrecked. But also, this man, John McLaughlin, with the Hudson's Bay Company, was ordering his men from Fort Vancouver to go down and attack the indigenous tribes there. And so the men fired on the village with cannons, resulting in the death of many Clatsop people.
And Anna, like, just to be clear, because the word was, even though the shipwreck killed these men, the word was that the native people had killed them, right?
Oh, you're right. I'm skipping over that part, but that's a really important key part, Libby, is that since the ship went down, they were blaming the Clatsop people for that incident, in which the Clatsop people had no blame. There was nothing that they did that made that ship go down. The Pacific Ocean made that ship go down. And so one woman named Jenny Mitchell, with the Clatsop tribes, she basically remembered this incident, and she remembered fleeing this attack as a young girl. She was interviewed in 1900 at the Oregon Historical Society's gathering, and she said that her father was killed in this attack. And in the book, Cole quotes her as saying, "I remember well when the village was bombarded. I was a small girl then. All the Indians ran back to the woods. I ran with my mother, and she carried my younger sister on her shoulders. In running through the woods, a stick caught one of my sister's eyes and tore it, and so
Oh,
she was called Squint Eye."
it's just incredible to have that kind of first person account on record of, a wreck and this attack that happened in 1829, the William and Anne. So obviously that was a horrifically violent and traumatic incident. But to be clear, like, the shipwrecks didn't always lead to negative experiences for Indigenous people. Anna, can you talk about how these wrecks, in some cases, were actually useful to the local tribes?
Uh, you know, Tony Johnson, the chairman of the Chinook Indian Nation, told me that some of these encounters were actually positive. Sometimes the tribes would mark whales that came ashore, and so that the first person that found them would get the choice cuts of blubber and meat off of those animals. And when these ships came came in to the shore, they would often just treat them the same way. It would be like, well, this is my ship. And that's because they're sovereign nations and they had always operated that way. And also, when these ships would come aboard the coastline to trade, sometimes they would bring ships with lifeboats or other materials to trade. And the Native American nations were really keen to trade for their lifeboats, not because they really liked the lifeboats or thought they were particularly seaworthy, but because those boats had metal aboard them and they could take the straps and the nails and the riggings off of these ships and use that metal. And so they would trade their canoes for the lifeboats just to get the metal.
Yeah, it's like that lifeboat does not look useful to us, but those nails, those are looking really good. You clearly did so much research for this documentary, and I'm guessing that you couldn't squeeze everything that you learned through the process into the actual doc. And I was wondering, what kinds of things did you leave on the cutting room floor? Like, was there anything that you really wanted to include, but it just didn't make it in?
Some of the best tape was when we were setting up the cameras. Like we would have to be setting up lights and cameras and all sorts of equipment and tripods and everything. And while we were doing that, we brought Cole Thrush, the author of Wrecked, with us on many of these shoots as an expert and also as kind of the unofficial host of the show of our documentary. And he was just so lovely, and he'd have these side conversations with all of these historians or with some of our different subjects, and they would be laughing and talking, and just the love of history and the interest in the history really came out in those discussions. And one such moment is kind of when Cole was talking to Donella Lucero, a museum volunteer down in Oahu, and her parents would actually salvage flour and lard and other items from ships that would come onto the coast. And she would basically make pie. The grandmother would make pie from salvaged flour and lard off of these shipwrecks. And so the story of the shipwreck pie was a really good zinger, and we got that into the film, which was really amazing.
What do you hope that people take away from your documentary Wrecked when they think about what they saw?
I hope, Libby, that people take more away from this very recent history on our coast, that real people are buried in unmarked graves along our coastline, that many Native American tribes suffered at the hands of those that came to our shores, and that tribes are still vibrant and sovereign, and they're still with us today here in the Northwest, and we're so very lucky to have them.
And if people want to watch it, how can they find Wrecked?
You can go to nwpb.org. That's nwpb.org. Thank you so much, Libby.
Thanks, Anna King, senior correspondent for Northwest Public Broadcasting and the director of Wrecked, her first documentary that she has directed. She's been a part of several recently, but this is her directorial debut. Always great to have you, Anna.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to always come on with you, Libby.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.